small, limited ways that we can. So I want to thank you for that. And I'd also like you to ask you to join me in a moment of silence, just as we pray for those who have suffered immensely, the innocent people on both sides of this conflict who have suffered tremendously, that we ask for comfort from them, but also I would like you to pray for me, and that somehow or another I can manage to be helpful to you tonight. So let's take just a moment and of silence. Amen. Let me share a PowerPoint with you, and but first I'd like to say that I don't think this is a tight presentation. That there are lots of loose ends, and there are things that refer to things that I haven't covered in it, and I find just that it was a particularly hard to put this into some kinds of systematic framework, but I think that's also because what we're dealing with is very complicated, and so I'd like to. What I tried to do last time was to lay out a perspective, a kind of moral framework for how to look and to understand and assess this conflict more deeply. I didn't necessarily want to use it as somehow moral prescripts that would tell us what we should do in this, but rather to use it as a framework for looking more closely into it. And just war theory consists of two parts. It's called one of jus ad bellum, which means justice of the war, and jus in bello, which means just conduct of the war. And so historically, just war theory listed 6 criteria that were used, that should be used to see whether war was justifiable. We tend to think of it as, was it just? But it really was justifiable rather than somehow another an exercise in justice. And then the second was jus in bello, which was how you conducted the war, so that you could have a just cause, a just reason for going to war, but that you could also conduct that war in a manner that was immoral. And you could actually not have a just cause for going to war, but yet conduct it in a manner that was moral. And in both instances, there are problems that arise, moral problems that arise. But nevertheless, this was the framework, and I think in its modern version, you come up with that what is a justifiable war is self-protection, when you are protecting your populations from those who would do harm to those populations. And secondarily, one that emerged during the Bosnian crisis, which is that you have a responsibility to protect those whom you can, who aren't being protected by their government. And so both of those lead to legally justifiable war. When it comes down to non-combatant, those largely remain the same, but there is non-combatant immunity, which basically means that both Israelis and Palestinians need to treat the combatants of the other community as if they were Israelis and Palestinians. So Israelis need to treat Palestinian non-combatants as if they were Israeli non-combatants, and the same with Palestinians. And so that's what it means. And proportionality has to do with you use the minimum amount of force necessary to achieve the objectives. Whether the objectives are legitimate or not depends on what were the war aims that you are pursuing. So Several weeks later, when it is clearer that what the outlines of this war are looking like, I think we find a couple of dilemmas that I think are worth looking at in more detail. The dilemmas that arise for Just Cause really center around what does it mean to destroy Hamas politically. And I think that has not been seriously looked at. One of the dilemmas that we face is that the military tactics that are being used work against the political objectives that might be sought. And because I think that the kind of massive destruction instills in the mind of Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs across the world that Israel is out to destroy them. And I think Israel, because of the attacks, feel like the Palestinians, particularly Hamas, is out to destroy them. And that basically means that the tactics you go at eliminating Hamas work against any objective in which Hamas or Palestinians might play into a political settlement of this situation. It polarizes the situation further. And I think the most likely outcome is what Nathan Brown, in his paper for the Carnegie Foundation, calls a long twilight of disintegration and despair. He faults the thinking on this as posing that there's going to be a day after, a day when the conflict ends and we then have in place some kind of achievable political arrangement, which would lead to a long-term statement. And he doesn't believe that's the case. He believes that what we're going to have is a long twilight of disintegration and despair, probably with Israeli occupation and more ongoing conflict without any possibility of resolving it. So Gaza basically will become a super camp of internally displaced persons. And amidst all this is the unanswered question of whom does Israel turn over control of Gaza and under what terms, when there is no central government and when Gaza is completely dependent on humanitarian aid. And I think the complexity of that question and the war objective of how do we reach a way in which somebody other than Israelis occupying the place takes responsibility for governing Gaza. And as Nathan Brown goes through, it's not going to be Israel itself. It's probably not going to be the Palestinian Authority, and it's probably not going to be some Arab league that would come in and do it. So that being the case, it's a real issue of what happens to this place after this war ends. And I think the challenge that Brown put to us was there's not going to be a day after. There's going to be an long struggle of disintegration and despair. And I think that is a horrendous outcome. And I don't know an alternative to that. I think it also raises dilemmas for that the military goals that are perhaps achievable leave political outcomes that aren't viable. And that's basically what I've been saying, that if your goal is to destroy Hamas, you put in place political outcomes they aren't viable. They aren't going to last. They aren't sustainable. And so that is a real dilemma for what are the war aims of this war. Destroying Hamas's governing ideology seems to be a legitimate one. But what it actually means when you try to convert those into military goals that you can achieve, I don't know what those are. And I think that it takes a lot of thinking of what does it mean to destroy Hamas politically when they are infused in all the infrastructure that is present in Gaza. So it shifts somewhat of the focus is if you aren't able to destroy Hamas politically and maybe not even militarily, should the goal instead be one of deterrence? And this was raised by the interview that Ezra Klein did with the Israeli, I forget his name that he was talking to. And he raised and said, the real objective for Israel in that UDF is to establish deterrence in Gaza and to establish deterrence in the wider Middle East. And that deterrence is something, security, in fact, is something that you aim for when you don't think you can have peace. And deterrence is a way of trying to achieve that security. However, it will entail a shift to a low level of combat that has no possibility whatsoever of resolving the conflict. And we have to take into account that terror is ultimately, deterrence is ultimately based on terror and fear of reprisal. And in that sense, it has as its objective a psychological goal, a goal to convince someone psychologically that acting in the way they would like leads to a response that we would be unable to endure. And that's a psychological goal. And how you achieve a psychological goal by military means, it seems to me to be very, very difficult to do. And so while it sounds in the abstract a possible goal that isn't the kinds of, well, it actually is the destruction that we are seeing, but doesn't have as the objective that it can wipe Hamas out, that in somehow or another it has to manage it and deal with it. That's complex. What it's going to result to is that Israel is going to feel like it needs to mow the grass every now and then, which is their term for containment. And what you add on to containment to make it deterrence is a willingness to inflict an unimaginable suffering on the other side, where to they attack or somehow exercise violence on the part of Israelis. That also seems to me to be a very unstable situation. As far as deterrence on the Palestinian point, it's just simply going to make the pain of occupation too great if it can. And I have no doubt that if Israel has its IDF as an occupying army patrolling and maintaining security in the West Bank, what Hamas and other Islamic groups are going to do is to pick them off, just like they did in Northern Ireland. They're going to be assassins on the tops of buildings shooting the troops as they patrol and assassinating troops as they patrol across the Gaza. And it's also, I suspect, very likely that it's going to lead to increased car bombings and terror bombings throughout the West Bank and in Israel as well, and Europe, and possibly even the United States. I think we're going to see an increase in that kind of terrorist act coming out of this war, and it's important to understand that this is the Palestinians' way of trying to deter action against them. That doesn't mean that it's morally justified or that it's even a good tactic, but I think that understanding why they are doing that is an important thing if you're going to propose options. Alternatives to that. There are also some dilemmas that I think for the conduct of war, namely, is there a way actually for the IDF to keep civilians casualties at a minimum and eliminate Hamas? Currently, I guess you can say that Israel feels like the answer to that is no, but I might want to look at it in a little bit more detail. Secondly, if not, what are the limits when responding to genocidal intent? Because the only proportional response to genocide is genocide. And where I'm going to a little bit later talk about what is genocidal intent. I think it's important to look at when we begin to feel that the Hamas has as its goal the elimination of Israel, and Israel has as its goal the elimination of Hamas and others in Gaza, that you are engaging in a rising escalation of conflict to a genocidal level. And I think that each side in this feels that the other side is acting with that intent. And then finally, does the failure to honor the laws of armed conflict discredit justifiable war aims? This historically always worked in one direction, that you first had a justifiable war aim and cause, and then you tried as best you could to fight it through armed conflict. I mean, through the laws of armed conflict, through non-combatant immunity and proportionality. It never has worked in reverse, so that if you couldn't conduct it in a just manner, it delegitimized the justifiable war maids. When the first time that began to arise was actually with the Catholic bishops and their their letter on nuclear deterrence, when they began to look at whether, since the means of conducting a nuclear war were so horrific, that it discredited any justified aims that war could have. And that's the first time it really began to move in that direction. But we now face that dilemma pretty squarely in this Israeli-Gaza conflict. Let me go through those, not so much to try to answer them, but to raise issues in perspective on each of these. So is there a way for the UDF to minimize civilian casualties and eliminate Hamas? And I think that depends on what kind of war you think the Gaza war is. Is it a duel where one of us is not going to get out of here alive? The great theorist of war, Clausewitz, thought that epitomized war, that it was a duel, that you went at it with the intention of making sure that other side did not emerge alive from that conflict. And a lot of what we see today seems to correspond to that dual nature in tactics, that we're going at destroying or leveling what is the others, or at least it's mostly Israel going at Gaza, leveling it because they feel that Gaza came at them with that same genocidal intent. Now, if it's not going to be a duel, then it's going to have to become something different. And here's where Clausewitz came up with war is politics by other means. Because one of the ways to interrupt the rivalry of war is to insist that war has some political objective that it's trying to achieve, rather than just the elimination of the other side. And that raises an important question, which is that we've hinted about previously I did, whether the achievable war objectives can in any way approximate what is achievable military objectives. And I think that's often lost in war, that we talk about, we're only able to achieve through war military objectives. And then the question has to be, are those military objectives approximate to what are the political objectives we're hoping to achieve? And quite often they're not. Quite often that we say we want a political objectives to make is, or whatever it is, but we find out that anything we can do militarily may even work in opposition to those political objectives, and in any cases far enough away from those political objectives that they are now unattainable. This is compounded because the Netanyahu government has been unwilling to specify that I can find any clear objectives about what they're trying to do. Netanyahu on Saturday gave a TV interview in Hebrew in which he rejected the Biden plan toward trying to get to a position where we could negotiate a two-state settlement post-war, and that the military objectives of the IDF should be moving to that political possibility. And it seems that what he wants is an ongoing presence, military presence, that allows him to manage and suppress the Palestinians forever, and to prevent them from achieving a separate state. So I haven't really heard from them what are, to my mind, clear military objectives from this, but fuzzy ones that prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And I think that leads to unimaginable terror and ongoing violence, both in Israel, Europe, the West Bank, Gaza, and the United States. And so I find his unwillingness to specify those very concerning. So what if you can't defeat Hamas with minimum casualties? What are the limits? when responding to genocidal intent. And I think it's important to know, because the words get thrown around a lot, that this is genocide, this is, and whether it is or not is an open question. But I thought it would be important to kind of look at what these definitions are, so that when we hear them, we know what's being said and what's being misused. War crimes are a serious violation of non-combatant immunity and proportionality against both combatants and civilians. So, and by both combatants, it means that against combatants, you should use no more force than is necessary to achieve the objective that you're seeking. If you have crimes against humanity, it's the extermination of or other crimes, mass crimes against any civilian population. And that gets categorized as crimes against humanity. That's slightly but related to genocide, which is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And it's composed of a genocidal intent and a genocidal action. And so the article that I sent out was by a professor who is Israeli. I'm trying to think where he is, and I don't recall right now. But he wanted to make the judgment that it wasn't at present necessarily genocidal genocide, but it was on its way, because there was clear genocidal intent on both sides, and what was debatable was whether there's genocidal action. And he did not think that as yet that was clear enough to say, but he thought that just the genocidal intent was important enough that a warning that should indicate to us that we should do anything we can to prevent that kind of genocidal action from occurring. And finally, because it also sometimes gets confused about this, is ethnic cleansing, which, by the way, is not a war crime, although it's strange that most people treat it as that and think of it as that, but it aims at removal rather than destruction of a population. So it is in many there is stuff going on in the West Bank that is deeply concerning about what is ethnic cleansing in different areas, Area B and Area C in the West Bank. I think probably with the intention of honoring the Netanyahu government pledge to annex the West Bank. And that I also find very disturbing. But as we begin to talk about limits, I think it's important to keep these definitions in mind when we are thinking about what is permissible and what is not, and what do we call what is happening. I got to find a way to go back. Sorry. So let's go back to the question that Eileen raised earlier. Does the failure to honor the laws of armed conflict discredit a justifiable war? And I think that that's somewhat the way I laid it out in previously, that it's possible, at least conceivably, morally possible, to conduct the war in such a horrendous action that you lose the justifiability of the war aims. But I also think that it depends greatly on is the Gaza War, a war of a colonized people against a colonial state, and that's the claim from many on the left when they want Israel to stop the genocide and to give Palestinians peace and to cease to have a ceasefire immediately and to negotiate their freedom. But I don't think that Israel is a colonial state. I think Israel is a refugee state. And if it is to the degree that that is a colonial state, it's a colonial state like no other colonial state in the world. That it isn't somebody from the outside who comes in and occupies the land and the labor of a place for its own benefit and enrichment. then what Israel is a refugee state of people who are fleeing and finding a place to go. And that colors how they look at that state in that relationship. And I think Palestine is not a colonized people, it's a displaced people under occupation. And so I think while these are important features and they heighten the moral issues and sensibilities involved in this, that it's not helpful to look at that through the lens of decolonization. Secondly, is this war a legitimate war of self-defense aimed at establishing security through deterrence? And I think that's an important question, because it is a different thing. If it's not going to be a duel, then they're going to have to be legitimate self-defense aims that Israel can achieve, and that those primarily happen through the establishment of security. And remember that security is what people want if they don't think they can have peace. So if that's the case, you have a real serious question as to whether how you establish that deterrence. Does it discredit the goal of security achieved that way? And I think that's a serious question we need to keep in mind and ask ourselves. Once again, doing two. So before I end, I just wanted to talk some, because you hear a lot of calls for ceasefire. And a ceasefire basically freezes the conflict. It doesn't resolve it. It just freezes it. And sometimes that's the best thing you can do. But it is important to realize that a ceasefire is essentially an agreement that masks a deeper disagreement. So that if you take the ceasefire that between Israel and Hezbollah, I forget how many years ago, both agreed to it because they thought the future would unfold in a different direction. Israel thought that the future would leave, a ceasefire would leave them more in control, more powerful, and better off with regard to Hamas. Hamas felt the same thing with regard to Israel, that a ceasefire would leave it better off, more empowered to pursue its goals. And they disagree about how the future is going to unfold. And the agreement of a ceasefire is dependent upon that disagreement. So what is a ceasefire, and which is what it's having put, where there is genocidal intent? That's hard to figure out, because if you really think that the other side is intending to wipe you off the face of the earth in something like a duel-like war, then a ceasefire at best kicks it down the road and does nothing to solve or to protect you from that genocidal intent. And so I think that it's a real, for those who think that the obvious goal should be to achieve a ceasefire, there are questions that attend that you need to address, so that a ceasefire doesn't simply make the problem worse later on. What is the likelihood of a permanent cessation of violence when it depends upon a negotiated settlement of a two-state resolution without a legitimate Palestinian entity with whom to negotiate, or an Israeli peace government? And I think it's that a permanent ceasefire would not lead to the automatic creation of a Palestinian entity. It's not clear to me what that Palestinian entity is. For the most part, the unpopularity of the Palestinian Authority is because people see it as a client of the Israeli state. That they're there to help Israel manage the West Bank. And so they feel that they're a collaborator with Israel rather than an entity that pursues the outcomes that they seek, which is either a one-state solution or a two-state solution. And so I think that the lack of who does the negotiation with Israel, and do they have the backing of the local population, is a serious impediment to reaching a peace agreement. And I think also it's the same with the Israeli government, that its goal and its intended goal is to mow the grass and manage the conflict and prevent the Palestinian Authority from pursuing its own independent state. And so in some ways, until there emerges a legitimate Palestinian entity that isn't going to happen all by itself, and that there isn't a government that really wants to reach a settlement with Palestine, I think a ceasefire would stop the violence, and that is in itself important, but it's not likely to lead in a good direction in the long term. So we have now a question of what should we do? How should we play our role? And I thought of a couple of things that we should not do and some things that we should do, as limited as they are. I think first we should not give in to some simplistic slogans. And I have found that that over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've been pushed to decide one side or the other, one simplistic slogan or another simplistic slogan that leaves out the reality of the other side. And so I think don't give in to it. I just say that they are, in the second one, false dichotomies, that it doesn't have to be this or that. It has to be both in many instances. And so there are, and here's where it gets to resist false polarization. This was a tactic that we developed with regard in Northern Ireland, and it came from the work of my colleague Lee Ross, who did experiments demonstrating that while the parties did differ, they weren't as polarized as the parties tended to think that they were. And part of that was because when they debated one another, they gave what were the strongest arguments for their position. And they ignored those in which they felt ambiguity, or they felt somehow restrained, or they couldn't reserved about them. They had qualms about what they were. They ignored those, just passed over them, and instead presented a face of absolute strong arguments. And the other side did the same. Now, if you think that false polarization is a product of an underestimation of the ambiguities that each side feel, it would be important to expose those ambiguities. And so what we suggested that facilitators of dialogue should do is ask each side to not role play, because what role play does is just mirror back the strong positions to each side, but instead to ask them what they thought the strongest arguments that the other side gave for its position. And that began to expose the areas of ambiguity and where we had qualms about the outcome and the arguments we were giving. And that had the possibility of exposing where common ground could emerge. And so I think that as you move forward and talk to friends and colleagues and other tense situations, refuse the false polarization paradigm that you're either this or that, but instead try to figure out what each side thinks is the strongest arguments that the other side gives. And in particular, I think this is important for churches, for college campuses, where you begin to get educated and real knowledgeable people talking about what is it that the other side is saying that I think is strong and is important and that we should consider. Secondly, so what should we do? That's what we shouldn't do. I think we need to recognize that the key to living together safely lies in fostering dignity, safeguarding livelihoods, and encouraging respect. And if you remember from last week's times, I think these three themes lead to outlining what it means to live in a shared future. And remember, a shared future is where we live with our disagreements safely. It's not where we reach some kind of common vision necessarily about what that future should be, but that we can live with the disagreements that we have with one another. And so I think that what gives us the possibility of outlining what it means to live in a shared future, we get those outlines when we treat the other as deserving dignity, as livelihoods that need to be protected and safeguarded, and people whom we should respect. And so I think through all we do, keeping these forefront in our interactions is important. And lastly, or not close to lastly, remember that the fundamental attribution error. And what that was also a term invented by Lee. And what he said was that when we face hard situations, we look at them and say, boy, this is really tough. How do we make the best of this situation? Since none of the options seem really good. And so we act. When we see the other side responding to the same difficult situation, we see their actions as not reflecting their assessment of how to respond to a real difficult situation. We see their actions as reflecting their true character. And so I think that this pertains to both sides as they look at what are the decisions the other side is making. And I think it behooves us to remember that they too, just like we, are making decisions against very difficult situations in which there's no good choice. And what they're not doing is showing you their inner character. And finally, I think the one thing we can do, and the thing that we should probably do, is pray. Because I don't know the outcomes of this. And I can see plenty of ways in which it becomes much, much, much worse, and few ways in which it becomes better. And so when we're in positions where we have nothing within our own power that we can appeal to, then prayer is a good response. And so I think foremost what we should do is pray that somehow the suffering that is occurring is alleviated and ended, and that somehow the seeds of peace are planted. And so with that, that's my spiel. And I would like to, I asked Oscar to join me in responding to questions when he felt like he wanted to. So let me turn it over and hear your thoughts and learn from you.
I just wanted to raise one point, Byron, about whether Israel is a refugee state. I think we need to look closer at the history. The Zionist movement began in the 1880s, and they managed to get the Balfour Declaration passed by the British government, which promised a Jewish homeland in Israel, in Palestine. From then, there proceeded the mandated control of Palestine by the British. And it was during that period that the Palestinian Arabs were a huge majority in that mandated territory from the start. And the Zionists emphasized immigration. And there was a policy that was that they emphasized, which brought in more Jewish refugees, or however you wanted to call it. But the Holocaust didn't come until much later. And so I think one of the things that's tough to do is to bring some of that history gently to the forefront. In that article by UC Halevi that you sent out, he talked about recognition of the Israelis as an indigenous people. I don't think of them as an indigenous people. and the claim to being an indigenous people based on a period when they were a kingdom seems to me pretty weak myself. So those are some of the things that strike me about the difficulty of getting the history straight.
Oscar, let me just respond briefly. I didn't mean as refugee that they were refugees from the Holocaust. I meant that it goes back to the very beginning when they were refugees from the pogroms in Russia, and so that it. And I recognize that there's an indigenous population. There's always been an indigenous Jewish population there, and it's been small. So that many of the people who are living there have the experience of fleeing violence and cruelty, and finding a place to go in response to that. I think that, and that I think, and I was posing it as an alternative to that what they are as colonizers, which I don't think they are.
Well, for sure, the pogroms were the motivating force for the Zionist movement.
Yeah. Other questions to Oscar or me or someone else? Evan.
Could you describe people and the ideas that you've heard that were promising, especially within Israel, but on both sides? And can you tell yet what October 7th and the last month has done to those people's ability to gain more support for their ideas?
Oscar, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Well, yeah, I think the political left in Israel is dead. And so any ideas that they may have had to promote are discredited badly. And so I myself have not really heard much, aside from maybe the article that Byron distributed with some proposals. I myself question whether international law makes any difference to the Israelis at this point. Maybe, but they are hell-bent on destroying Hamas, and they're prepared to pay an enormous price. So I think that is the scary thing, because this is an existential war. For them, what's at stake is the state of Israel, yay or nay.
I agree, Oscar. And so, Evan, my response would be Oscar's response. And I think, let me say one thing. I think that existential rivalry is like a duel, and that both sides feel that one of us is not walking away from here. And if that's the case, the only thing that can interrupt that rivalry is the interjection of political goals rather than the destruction of the other side. And I'm unclear about what those political goals could be and whether they are persuasive to either side. Well, to the Israelis, because of their general framework is more unified, but with the Palestinians increasingly. Is there a way to live with Israel in this? And I think that the belief in that possibility has been seriously questioned and undermined. Rachel,
Yeah, it may be a question of semantics, but I am curious why your thought that Israel is not a colonial state. And I just looked up on Wikipedia, and it talks about settler colonialism as distinct from exploitation colonialism. But settler colonialism occurs when colonizers invade and occupy territory to permanently replace the existing society with the society of the colonizers. It's exogenous domination, typically organized or supported by an imperial authority. So I'm just curious why your thought is that it's not a colonial state.
because it wasn't established, a couple of reasons why. It wasn't established in a military way. The establishment of the state of Israel was in a military way, but the actual presence of them was not military. In large part, they bought the land. So if Israelis bought the land and there was no prior state of Palestine, then I think the features of a colonial situation aren't there. I think that it's important to realize that that at the time in which the Ottoman Empire fell apart, there was a mixture of people there, each one in a particular outcome, but it wasn't as if it was a Palestinian ownership of the entire region, and that somehow or another that was a state that was there, and that an outside entity came in and colonized it. It just seems to me that there are certain aspects that may resemble that, but there's more dissimilarity than similarity.
I think, Byron, people need to understand that under the Ottoman Empire, there was no entity that was unified. There were 3 districts. And then you've got to understand the role of the League of Nations after World War I and the mandate system. The mandate system established certain areas where France and Britain had control. Britain controlled Palestine. So the Zionists never invaded Palestine.
Yeah.
They were allowed in, and they grew and they pursued their efforts. The only time war broke out really on a mass scale was 48. And what happened was, after World War II ended, the British were still in control. And Israeli terrorist organizations fought the British presence. And the British said, we're getting out. They turned the matter over to the United Nations. There had been several plans for partition. The United Nations handed over the job of drawing a partition to a well-regarded diplomat. He proposed a partition. It was rejected. That partition would have allowed for a 2-state solution. And it was then that the war broke out. But the Palestinians weren't in possession of a great army. And that's why, it became a wider conflict. And so that's a part and parcel of the answer to the colonialization argument.
Oscar, I'd add to that two things. One, in the 36 rebellion that took place, the British wiped out the Arab leadership. I mean, the notion of there being Palestine grew up in tandem with the notion that there was Israel or Israelis and Palestinians. So that they grew up in a rivalry seeking to claim that land as a state. But it wasn't as if there was a group that owned that state beforehand. Secondly, much of the establishment of Jews in that area occurred in the mid to late 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire wanted to increase its tax revenue, so that it required the owners of the land to register the land so they know whom they could get taxes from. And so many people in Beirut registered the land in their name, because the local Palestinian workers and peasants didn't want the government to know about them. But they kept the same rights as you can farm the land and give us rent to the land in the same way you've always done. What happened later on was that those same people in Beirut began to sell it to Jews who wanted to move there and farm the land. And so I think that the presence there is connected to buying the land, coming there, but that's been a way of doing things for a long time. So I just wanted to put that kind of evidence in there to make the situation even more complex.
I think another factor is that the Zionists didn't know the Arab culture.
Yeah.
They didn't know these people, and they really didn't want to.
Yeah.
And so what surprised them was the growth of Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism occurred during that early period. And so there were questions about whether it was going to be a pan-Arab Muslim movement, or whether they were going to get caught up in their individual states. And everyone ended up with a state except the Palestinians.
What was I going to say? Sorry. The notion that these entities grew up in tandem with one another. That the area was known prior to that as Greater Syria, and it included all of that region as well as the regions up there we think of as Syria today. But that's if people thought about their geographic identity, it was that identity as Greater Syria. It was only when people began to try to create identities and to establish states did you get this kind of bifurcation in which both sides created their identity in opposition to one another.
Byron Joy has her hand up.
Joy, sorry. And Leaf seems to have it up too.
And Angelo.
Oh.
So I was wondering more about what's happening in the United States, and particularly on campuses. And with this use of language from river to sea, or whatever the saying is it your sense that students actually support Hamas, support Palestinians, are anti-Zionist, or are we seeing a huge movement of anti-Semitism? How would you look at the protest and, again, some of these slogans that are being yelled, and it's very disturbing on the one hand as to if they really understand what they're saying in some cases.
I'm not on campus, at least not the way that I used to be. and I'm somewhat distanced from it. What I can gather from talking to different people is it's incredibly toxic, and that the polarization there is deep, and is threatening the climate of free speech. And so, in part, I think that the way to move forward is through the kind of false polarization dynamics that I explained. As it is right now, both sides claim strong arguments that ignore what the other side's experience and lives are about. And so to try to find a way to move forward, it's important to take into account the strong arguments that the other side makes, and to acknowledge to them that I recognize the legitimacy of those arguments, even if I can't necessarily endorse them the way you do. I think that's the path forward. How to get there is going to mean dismantling some of the paradigms through which people view events. And so I think in part of the reason that I got into the discussion with Oscar and pushed the notion of that Israel is a refugee state is to counter it, to counter the colonialization paradigm through which many young people view these events. So that if you think it is that what you are is a colonized people engaged against the throwing off of a colonizing group, then you can't fight the war through just means. It just means you lose it. And so you're always pushing the edges of that, because if you go up with conventional ways, you lose that. You don't have the airplanes, you don't have the tanks, you don't have the discipline, you don't have the armies to do this. The only way that you can be effective is to work on them in the margins. Many of us would like that to be a nonviolent struggle, and think that that is the better way to pursue those aspirations and goals than it is to engage in armed conflict. Unfortunately, that's not the opinion of many Palestinians or Israelis. And but I think that it is quite serious, and it's reflective of other issues as well. I mean, I think the campus has been polarized for a long time, and that it's not been a climate where you could have the kinds of discussions that those of us who are approaching much older age remember as the campus climate that we loved and participated in. It's become something that's quite alienating and toxic.
Okay.
If there's somebody who has more experience of that than I do, I would welcome hearing from you and being educated by from you.
Leaf has his hand up, Byron.
Leaf.
Yeah, so my question is about Netanyahu, and he was so unpopular in Israel even before October 7, and now when he so clearly failed to protect the country, he's even more unpopular in his cabinet. But it seems like he needs a state of war to stay in power, and if he's out of power, or that if war ends, he's out of power, and then may face prison like Trump is. So he seems to be a particular barrier to any resolution.
I think that's.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Byron.
Go ahead, Oscar, please.
He's brought in Benny Gantz. He's established a war cabinet, and he's brought in a former general into that war cabinet. He hasn't included the extremists on the right. So people are hopeful that that'll have some ameliorating effect on him. But he's got some crazy ideas about his role in Israeli history, where he's the greatest prime minister ever. And he's not giving up on that. And of course, he needs the judicial reform to protect him against prison. So in that sense, the military decisions can be compromised.
Yeah, Leif, I read that he's very weak, and then from the article I sent out, that as soon as the war is over, he's out, and that's just the way it's going to be. I think that's a little bit too pat. That it depends a lot on how the war ends. It will end because you just can't sustain it forever. But when it does, I think it depends a lot on what the alternatives are. I mean, you can have you can make horrendous choices simply because the alternative was worse.
You've got Angelo there, Byron.
Angela, sorry.
That's okay. It was. I'm curious. Last summer, there was a debate within Israel about this. There was a big debate about the Supreme Court, and I've been reading that there's been a struggle within Israel about a more secular Israel, and correct me if I'm wrong though. Okay, but and a more I think Orthodox, and I've read that part of that is fueled by as the settlers in the West Bank have gotten more political influence, it shifted Israel more to the right. Is that true? And is that going to be even if Netanyahu came to power because he created a certain coalition that brought more extremist right wing, people in this, he needed that particular coalition. But even if Netanyahu's gone, and Oster said that the Israeli left basically doesn't have any influence, will that political, I'm assuming the settler move, that a lot of the settlers in the West Bank would not want any sort of Palestinian state. Is that one of the major obstacles? First, correct me if I'm right or wrong, but also is that one of the big major obstacles for the past few years?
Well, I can start. Netanyahu came to power with a coalition in January, and he put together the coalition that included two extremists on the right. One was called Itmer Ben-Gvir. He was a surprise candidate. He did very well, and his support was necessary to give Netanyahu the ability to form a coalition. The other guy is Bezalel Smotrich. He lives in the West Bank, and he's a settler. And so they came up with an agenda, and then there was a third person who put together the judicial reform. The amazing thing was there was no discussion of judicial reform during that election. The first day after the election was decided, the Minister of Justice put out this enormous package of judicial reforms. And so that judicial reform controversy sucked the attention of everybody. And so during that whole period, we saw thousands of people marching to say, no, this is going the way of Hungary. We don't want that. Well, of course, those people were denigrated as traitors and so on. Many of the reservists refused to fight or say they would. Well, then all of a sudden, October 1st, and those very people who were marching turned out to go into service and provide help where needed. So whether Netanyahu, he's trying as hard as he can through methods which are his stock and trade, he blames everybody else. I don't know if you heard the evening news on Sunday where he was asked about will he resign, and he said, well, nobody asked FDR to resign after Pearl Harbor, did they? You know, complete nonsense.
Mhm.
But he can't get away with it here in the United States. People are seeing it. So and during his 16 years, he never once promoted anything as a two-state solution. He was openly against it. Barr, turn it over to you.
I think that's right. So I wouldn't add anything to what you say, Oscar. Other than when I do take seriously that when this passes, when this ends, the political scene in Israel is going to be up for grabs.
Yeah, it's going to be a dramatic change.
Yeah, I mean it is, and how and what I don't think we know. What I think that will set the contours out is that the idea that it's just easy to make peace with Palestinians is gone from the Israeli consciousness, and then I think it's in serious doubt whether they think any effort to make peace would be successful. And so if that's the case, what are your alternatives? And so somehow or another, there has to be the creation of a different alternative to this that is grounded in the Israeli fears and the Palestinian fears. But I think they face different. In Israel, there is leadership in vying whether you can build a coalition around trying to seek some resolution to this conflict. Whether that coalition can be built is an open question. In the case of Palestinians, I don't know. The leadership has been so destroyed. I don't know how you get it. I don't know who could play that role. And that now becomes an issue for Palestinians, but it also becomes a real problem for Israelis.
And if you're talking about dignity, the brutality of the attack by Hamas really pierced deeply into the Israeli soul. And that was everything the state was supposed to protect them against. And here you have this group right on your doorstep, right in your own country.
I think that the way forward goes back to that little thing we created at SCICN, which is that it's not agreements that make peace possible, but peaceful relationships makes agreements possible. And so I think that you have to center on, is there a way to create, to shift and alter the relationships with Israelis and Palestinians? And that there may be a role for the United States in trying to urge those things in that direction. But they're awful hard to affect from the outside.
I remember, and I don't know how many of you were there when we had, I think it was Jeff Browning, and we had a dialogue with a rabbi. Was that 30 years ago? Does anyone else remember that? And it went
Yeah,
okay until we asked a certain question. And then the rabbi, did he actually leave? He got very upset with us. So it's not a new issue, obviously. And there still is, it's so hard to talk about.
well, I made a presentation with Rabbi Shelley Lewis. He would never walk out. It was probably Ari Carton. But at that presentation, I distributed copies of the Hamas charter. It was quite clear from that charter what they had in mind ultimately. And that was the destruction of Israel. And the phrase that they used was from the Jordan to the sea. And that's where Congressman Taib ran into trouble. Those are inflammatory words.
Yeah.
That means we destroy them. They have no right here. End of story. And if you look at the history of Hamas, they, after the Oslo agreements, they started the bombings, of selected bombings. That was the second intifada. The first intifada, they were throwing stones. That was an easier one. But they have never come to the table with proposals that I'm aware of.
I think it's important to keep in mind the notion of spoilers. And what we tend to realize that in any kind of peace negotiation, there are people whose their intended action is to prevent that agreement from coming about. And so it isn't as if they're acting in ways that are trying to seek a peace agreement and failing to do that. Their intention is to make sure it doesn't happen. And we tend to underestimate the role that they do. And I think in particularly in this conflict, that there are settlers and other groups that intend to what they want a greater Israel. In any two-state solution they're working against. They're not working for and failing, they're working against. And Hamas is that kind of organization as well. But what I think is important is to realize that the lack of reaching agreement is success in their eyes.
And you've got spoilers on both sides.
Right.
Yep.
You've got Rachel there, Byron.
Rachel.
I have another question, and even though I'm not a student on the college campus, I think this may be some of the questions that students have. And one of them is what is the discussion around Netanyahu's support of Hamas in order to divide Gaza and the West Bank and the PLO, so that to divide the Palestinians, to my understanding is so that there would be opposition to the two-state solution, that after that at that time there was a lot of support and it looked like that may have happened, but Netanyahu, my understanding is, and his government was not in favor of that, and that that money was channeled from Israel to Qatar to Hamas. Hamas, and Israel knew this, was using some of it to gain support from the Palestinians in terms of building schools, clinics, giving humanitarian support to the Palestinians in Gaza, and other money was being used to build up militarily Hamas. And that at that time, Netanyahu always thought, well, Hamas will stay small and we can control him. So for me, the situation is very confusing. And like you said, there really, or Obama said, there's kind of blood on both sides. But what is the thinking about Israel and Netanyahu's support of Hamas, which clearly got out of control? And then the other question, and I understand, the river to the sea, but it was my understanding that Netanyahu's government and the Likud party, they also wanted Israel to be from Jordan to the sea. So the whole thing gets very confused, and the pointing of fingers, Hamas clearly was brutal and terroristic and threatened Israel's, to the core, as you said, an existential threat. And they thought they were safe, with the fences, with the security. And it was a horrible thing. But I'm just confused about the role of Israel in supporting Hamas in order to derail the two-state solution, which, if there had been good support for it, you can't look back and say would have, could have, should have, but in some ways, does it help to sort of think, okay, if would have, could have, should have, then does it help to form, how to move ahead?
Well, it's pretty simple. Divide and rule. That's what Netanyahu had in mind. He wanted to divide a unified Palestinian institution. And so he's never been a supporter of a two-state solution. What you have to understand is the history of Hamas, which came into existence in 1988, and the history of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which part of which is the Palestinian Authority. There was an election in Gaza in 2005 or 6, and Hamas defeated the Palestinian Authority. And ultimately, the Palestinian Authority withdrew. So there was this division, this antagonism, and Netanyahu was more than happy to use that wedge. And he spoke about it openly. And so they arranged for funds to go to Hamas, which were misused. That was not the Israeli people. They would have been appalled had they known it. That was Netanyahu and his idea of leadership, because he felt he could silence Hamas. He could go into negotiations with Saudi Arabia, exclude the Palestinians from that, and go forward. So I think that is the understanding. I'd like to make one point. Israel never used the slogan from the Jordan to the sea, never. Israel has a group that wants to annex the West Bank. That's a very different thing, because the West Bank is already an occupied territory. It never should be annexed, but it's a different battle.
I once sat with a group from Northern Ireland when it was basically a bunch of paramilitaries and also their ex-combatant leaders, and they were meeting at Stanford to talk about how to manage the summer. And one of the people actually was a Republican who was going on about how they had the loyalists on the run. They were winning here and they were running here, and the loyalists were on the run and losing. And I said to him, you're working counter to your outcome you want, because you need a strong loyalist leadership. Because a weak loyalist leadership can't make the concessions you need them to make. And I think that Netanyahu is reaping that here. And it goes beyond Netanyahu, but particularly with him, that you destroy the possibility of leadership, and then you have nobody you can talk to, and nobody who can deliver any of the concessions you need them to deliver. So that's one part of this dilemma. I think that much of this kind of talk is misdirected and is camouflaging, for some way or another, just the horrific stuff that Hamas did. This is not the overthrowing of a unbearable situation, as unbearable as the situation is. It's people who have decided cruelty is the way forward. And I think it needs to stay that way. That does not mean that I think there hasn't been cruelty on the Israeli side. I think there has been, and I've seen it. But I don't think we can move forward with a comparison of who is the most cruel and most responsible for cruelty. That it has to be who can create an alternative that can achieve the allegiance of both sides. And at that point, I turned to Mandela. What people saw in Mandela was, if you want to know what peace in South Africa looks like, it looks like Mandela. That's what it looks like. And I will be willing to make concessions to Mandela that I said I'd never make, because he offers me the possibility of the peace he embodies about it. And so if I look to the leadership of Israel, what kind we need one in which Palestinians look to that leader and says, that's the leader I can make the concessions to that I said I'd never make, and vice versa. And so I think that is the dynamic that we're missing here. And I don't know how actually we get to that.
Well, it's interesting to think about this. What concessions can Hamas make? They're being beaten up badly. They could change their charter, but no one would credit it. There are, I think, 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza. There are 3 million in the West Bank.
Yeah.
So Palestinian Authority has a greater population over which it should be influential. And yet Mahmoud Abbas has been very weak. Perhaps one of the things that will happen will be a new emergent leadership within those ranks of the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority.
I think, the only concession that I think Hamas can make that would be of any useful is to decide it goes away. And it's not going to make that concession. So they're not a negotiating partner, and having them as a negotiating partner is a major impediment to reaching a peace agreement. But I was taken by the polling that the other interview that I gave out with Ezra Klein, but the chief issue most of the time is corruption. I mean, that's the issue that is on Palestinians' mind is corruption in Hamas and corruption in the Palestinian Authority. And I think that somehow or another there has to be a real concerted effort led toward creating the kind of responsible governmental structures in the West Bank that could assume responsibility for that territory and living peacefully with Israel.
Byron, we might want to consider taking one last question because we're going to be reaching 8:30 pretty quickly.
Okay.
Who would be brave enough to ask one last question?
How about you, Jane?
Oh my goodness, I'm not the right one. I'm a good asker of questions, but not the asking of questions.
So I have one, and that is
There's Bob Barrett has a question.
Bob Barrett. Hi, Bob.
Hello, and thank you. Byron, I really have appreciated being part of this session tonight. Learned a lot. It's very complicated. My question is that it's clear when conflict goes unaddressed, when there is not a some kind of legitimate process for forming relationships and reaching agreements and making things slightly better, but hopefully steadily better over time, that a lot of people, in addition to the immediate combatants, a lot of people are damaged or die or have their lives tremendously disrupted. You mentioned some of the research that you and Lee Ross have done, and I know that there are lots of other people from the theory building world that are working on these issues. Do you, and this is in hope that it will be it will invite us to leave on a hopeful note this evening. Do you see instances of ideas that are practical and closely enough attended to by the political powers that be in the world that something might be done that turns out positive?
I have some hope, Bob. I hope that the issue of where Palestinians have citizenship drives the conversation. Because I think that it puts front and center something that should be sensitive to Jewish consciousness, which is what it's like to live in a world where you aren't a citizen and no one is responsible for protecting you, and that what we're doing is subjecting Palestinians to do that, and that is untenable, and that we have to figure out. And the international community owes the Palestinian state, maybe not. I don't know that, but I know they owe them citizenship somewhere. And so the discussion needs to focus on where are they going to have citizenship, and that seems to bypass the logjam about whether we can take the security risk to have a state, whether we can't, where the borders are, all that kind of. Start there and then work out the implications. So that if you decide they're going to be citizens in Palestine, then that has certain ramifications. That the borders get drawn at roughly the 67 borders. That Palestinians' right of return go to the Palestinian state. That there is and we then would begin on doing that stuff. If we're going to have one thing, then there are going to be settlements everywhere. There are going to be Palestinian settlements, there's going to be Israeli settlements, and we figure out how to make that work. That's not going to be easy, but we're in the task of trying to figure out how to make that work, rather than thinking about why we can't get to the outcome that we want. And so I think that has some promise about that. I also think that the notion of that ultimately the notion is of how do we share the future together, and that most kind of conflict resolution processes go at it by trying to identify where we agree about things and build on those. I think they should start and stick with where we disagree and how do we make those disagreements safe, because I don't think that there is the possibility of reaching agreements across those lines, and if there are, they'll be mixed with all kinds of disagreements. So we should be focusing on how do we create a climate in which Israelis can have different goals and and disagree with much of what Palestinians do, but they manage to do so safely with one another. And the key features of creating that kind of shared future are the ones that I mentioned. How do we foster dignity? With dignity meaning how I think about myself, so that I've seen throughout this interaction how people there try to remove the dignity of whatever dignity people had. I think it has to do with how do we safeguard lives, which have to do with corruption, but also how do you build the infrastructure where people have the possibility of leading a meaningful and moderately successful, fluent, flourishing life. Doesn't have to be merely economic. And then finally, how do we encourage respect? Respect is, and I count respect as different from dignity, in that dignity is about how I think about myself. Respect is about how I think about you. And I think if where those don't give particular policy prescriptions, if we make those the policy goals, we go a lot toward creating that kind of future where it's safe to disagree. Now that's some hope. I think also there's one more hope. I think that there's the possibility, if nonviolence were moved, and I urge this but got nowhere to it, move from a Gene Sharp model in which it's just force against force, political power versus political power, to what are the types of things we need to do in a nonviolent movement which alter and change the relationship. And then I would go to the 4 questions we identify of how do we envision that future? How do we gain trustworthiness of each other? How can we accept the losses that's going to impose upon us? And how do we rectify the injustices that stand in the way of achieving less injustice? And I think that offers a place forward, and what we need to do is to try to create a climate in which there's a will to do that.
Thank you.
I guess I get to be idealistic too.
And we appreciate it. Byron, thank you. Please
Thank you.
hear all of our thanks. And it would be lovely if you all unmuted and just gave Byron one shout out of thanks.
Well, Oscar too. I mean, I'm not in this.
And Oscar, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Byron.
Byron.
Thank you.
Oscar,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate
You
it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Byron.
Thank you.
Have a
And-
good evening.
Good night.
Oh, is this going to be on YouTube? I guess.
Yes, it will be. It will be recorded.
okay.
It has been recorded and it will be posted on the church YouTube page
Okay, good.
tomorrow.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
both.
Stay with you.
Thanks for showing up, you guys.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Night.